Welcome, everybody. Let us begin. Welcome, everyone. I am Margot Crawford. I'm the director of the Center for Africana Studies, and this event today is co-hosted by the Department of Africana Studies and the Center for Africana Studies, and it is also co-sponsored by the Department of English. And many of you will know that Professor Farron Jasmine Griffin used to teach here at Penn, used to teach in the Department of English for many years. And today we are celebrating Read Until You Understand, the profound wisdom of Black life and literature. Farron Jasmine Griffin keeps teaching us how to read Black life, how to read Black literature. And I want to begin with some of the words that many of you who have read and are already reading and rereading this book, you will have already heard these words because they are indeed on the back cover of this book. But I want to start with Elizabeth Alexander's words because I simply adore them. Read Until You Understand gives us Farron Jasmine Griffin in full and mighty sail. Keen cultural analysis, storytelling, and gorgeous lyricism combine in this book that makes a genre of its own. And now I want to move to Carlos Lozado's words about Read Until You Understand. He writes, "This is a life lived among books, then reinterpreted through them." And he continues, Farron Jasmine Griffin's Read Until You Understand feels like multiple books captured in a single volume, yet none could quite survive without the others. I love that idea of the multiple books because for me, if I was continuing his review, what I would say is as a student of African American literature, as someone who collects Farron Jasmine Griffin's books, who reads and rereads them, I think about all of the multiple books, everything she has written before this book that I feel as I read and reread, Read Until You Understand the profound wisdom of Black life and culture. So for some of you who may not already know all of these titles, maybe you're just beginning to read Farron Jasmine Griffin with this latest title, I want you to hear all of the flow, all the layering, all the rupture that we can feel simply by hearing the titles of her tremendous body of work. Who Set You Flowing? The African American Migration Narrative. If You Can't Be Free, Be a Mystery. In Search of Billie Holiday. And I love that people are snapping. That's right. You know, if you can't be free, be a mystery. Come on, Rita Dove. She gets the title from Rita Dove. Clawing at the Limits of Cool, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, and the greatest jazz collaboration ever. Harlem Nocturne, Women Artists and Progressive Politics During World War II, Beloved Sisters and Loving Friends, Letters from Addie Brown and Rebecca Primus, Toward an Intellectual History of Black Women, Uptown Conversation, The New Jazz Studies, and then Read Until You Understand the profound wisdom of Black life and literature. Once again, we hear in all of these titles that flow, that layering, that rupture, as Farron Jasmine Griffin steadily writes across genres and into the deepest zones of Black study. Her first book pivoted on flow. Who Set You Flowing? The African American migration narrative set an entire generation of African American literature scholars like me in motion. This groundbreaking text revealed the different shapes of the African American migration narrative in literature, music, and visual art. Griffin refers in this first text to, quote, the ancestor who is herself a migrant as she made readers imagine layers of flow and what James Baldwin refers to as, quote, the deep water of Black aesthetics. The title of, as you've already heard me say, If You Can't Be Free, Be a Mystery, comes from Billie Holiday's poem Canary, the final words in that poem. Fact is, the invention of women under siege has been to sharpen love in the service of myth. If you can't be free, be a mystery. Farah Jasmine Griffin's study of Billie Holiday opened up the mystery of Black feminist radicalism, the mystery of imagining the unimaginable. I could go on and on. I could tell you about each of her books, but what I want you to know is she stays in that deepest water of Black study. I want to, without more delay, just tell you a bit about where she is located before we welcome her to this stage. Farah Jasmine Griffin is the William B. Ransford Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. She was also the inaugural chair of the African American and African Diaspora Studies Department at Columbia University. Without any more delay, join me in welcoming Farah Jasmine Griffin.
That's a homecoming welcome. Thank you so much. I'm just kind of overwhelmed right now. Margot, thank you. You know, one thing about when I know I'm going to come to Penn and give a talk, I think maybe Margot will introduce me because, like, who wouldn't want to be introduced in that beautiful way? I'm so grateful. One of the last talks I gave before we shut down was in this room. Like, it was it was February 23rd because it's my birthday. So it was around the 23rd, like it was around that time. And we were here celebrating the new collection that the library had just acquired. And I actually, at the invitation of Barbara Savage, my dear friend and colleague, read, very nervously, read a section of something that would become a part of this book. And so I feel like this is a home of the book as well. I am very grateful to be able to talk about the finished book here with you, especially to have been invited by English and Africana here at Penn, two of my intellectual homes. Even after going on to Columbia to teach, those spaces remain my intellectual homes, and my colleagues with Guthrie and Herman and Barbara and Margot, my intellectual family. So I'm very grateful. I want to especially thank Gail and Margot for inviting me, for pulling this all together. I want to thank Taya and Sean for all they did to make this possible as well. So I began writing what would become Read Until You Understand during the 2016 presidential campaign, though I'd been thinking of it and writing toward it for many, many years prior to that. In many ways, I've been writing toward it my whole life. But the campaign season and the subsequent election helped to crystallize my ideas about why African American literary history was so important to helping us understand the history of the nation and its struggle toward democracy. I finished the book during the spring and summer of 2020, which was a period of the global pandemic, as well as the global protests that followed the murder of George Floyd. So those are the bookends of this book. I had 3 goals in mind when writing this book. One, most importantly, I wanted to share my passion for a body of literature written by African American writers and to offer a way of reading them that might illuminate our understanding of some of the most pressing issues of our time. As I say in the book, I wanted to draw upon a lifetime of reading and close to 30 years of teaching African American literature to explore how, in addition to addressing concerns about democracy, actually even more than these, that the works themselves speak to ideas and values that have concerned humanity since the beginning of time. I wanted to share a series of valuable lessons learned from those who have sought to better a nation that depends upon, yet too often despises them. but in the process, they've changed the world. 2, I wanted to honor the many teachers in my life, in person and on the page, most especially my very first teacher, my father, who died when I was 9 years old, and the writings of the great Toni Morrison. Both my father and Ms. Morrison's writings have shaped my life and my learning in ways for which I am forever grateful. 3, I wanted to give a gift to book lovers, to readers, with this book about books, a book that aspires to be a work of literature in and of itself. Consequently, my academic colleagues and my graduate students were not my primary audience, though they are clearly welcomed within the pages here, and they're welcome to join a large body of readers for whom I wrote the book. My father was my first teacher here in Philadelphia, a Philadelphia that was still recognizable from W.E.B. Du Bois's The Philadelphia Negro, even though for us it was the late 60s and early 70s. And on long walks to Independence Mall, past Mother Bethel AME Church and other historic sites, he introduced me to the history of the founding of this nation and of our city's role in it. He told me stories of the founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, but also the founders of the Free African Society, Absalom Jones and Richard Allen. His lessons range widely into the ideas of Black American thinkers, from Frederick Douglass to Angela Davis. He was a voracious lover of books and jazz music. He was rarely without a paperback book in his back pocket or an album on the stereo. His Philadelphia was urbane and music-filled, reaching back to the bebop era with Dizzy Gillespie, moving up and including John Coltrane and Billie Holiday, on through rhythm and blues and the newly emerging sound of Philadelphia. His book collection included works of history, fiction, biography, and current events. And when he died, I inherited all of his books and albums and the love of learning filtered through so much that he bequeathed to me. Under the careful guidance of my mother, I lost myself in pages and the sounds that he left behind. This was my inheritance. It was my legacy. I had no idea that it would become my life's work as well. This moment of loss, seeking and remembering, constitute the genesis of my own intellectual pursuits and is the starting point for my book, which brings together a lifetime of reading and, as I noted, close to 3 decades of teaching African American literature, theory, culture, and history. But it also reflects on the shaping influences of my father and the city of Philadelphia and my upbringing during the last decades of the 20th century. Through a combination of memoir, historical examination, literary analysis, I have tried to reveal the riches of a community that demonstrated an ethics of care to me and my mother following my father's death, even when that community itself was often under siege. I've hoped to honor so-called ordinary working-class Black people who forged an extraordinary heritage and passed on a way of knowing and being in community. And in addition to trying to reveal that ethics of care, I've also tried to delineate what I think of as an aesthetic of care that's evident in the works that portray Black life, especially in the United States. Finally, through a series of questions throughout the book, a series of questions and suggested answers emerge. What might an engagement with an urban cultural legacy alongside Black literature and to a lesser degree music and the visual arts teach us about our nation and its quest for democracy and belonging? And beyond the slippery concepts of race and nation, what might engaging these ideas teach us about the fullest blossoming of humanity? I believe all Americans, indeed all freedom-loving people globally, should have exposure to and an understanding of what Black writing, as well as its related arts, offers and what it portends for the way forward. Read Until You Understand opens with the sentence, "This book begins with a girl and ends with grace." It is organized around 10 concepts, themes, and ideals: legacy, mercy, Black freedom and the idea of America, justice, rage and resistance, death, love, joy and self-determination, beauty, and yes, grace. Each chapter provides an autobiographical meditation and cultural commentary that may be informed by some mixture of history, philosophy, or politics. My turn to autobiography is to both tell a singular story and to note ways in which that story is but a thread in the larger fabric of Black American life in the United States, one that connects generations like my father's and mine. In this way, my book both examines and contributes to a tradition of writing that has always placed great value on the critical insights of autobiography and on ways of communicating history and culture. The richness of the works that I write about, blended with stories from my own family and community, resonate with and amplify the notion of literature as equipment for living, as Kenneth Burke said, and demonstrates the ways that the humanities themselves help to give us materials to live with, to accompany us on our journey with others on this planet. I try to reveal how a people have lived for generations with style, grace, brilliance, and beauty in the face of persistent crisis and catastrophe. Let me turn now to the book. I want to share a selection from the third chapter, Black Freedom and the Ideal of America. This chapter was not part of the original outline for the book, or at least not in the form that it appears here. There was to have been a chapter on freedom, but it evolved into a consideration between the relationship between Black freedom and the idea of America. And its idea, with that cutesy way that we academics do, idea, then an L is in parentheses, so idea, ideal of America. While most of the book centers around my upbringing here in Philadelphia and the city's history is a common thread throughout the book, this chapter is actually a product of my having relocated to Philadelphia for 1 month in July 2019. I spent the entire month here. And in fact, much of it came to me, or as I like to think of it, the book told me what it wanted to say, and that it wanted this chapter around the city's celebrations of independence in 2019. So, you know, you're here in Philly, you know, like maybe Boston, it's one of those cities that really takes the 4th of July seriously, right? And so there were all these sort of, you know, pending celebrations, like there always are. And it just, the book revealed itself. I mean, the chapter revealed itself and unfolded, and we can talk about that in question and answer. So in reading selections from this chapter, I hope that I'll give you a sense of the book's form, its arc, the way that autobiographical reflections lead into readings and analysis of a selection of texts, which then open out to broader observations about or meditations on the ideals, values, and political implications contained both within the autobiographical reflections and the text. So we will start. And I'm not going to read you the whole chapter. I'll just read around it. Okay. At some point in 1st or 2nd grade, administrators from my neighborhood school reached out to my parents and expressed concern that I refused to stand for the Star-Spangled Banner during school assembly. I attended the neighborhood elementary school, McDaniel, less than a block from my home. It was predominantly Black and sat diagonally across the street from St. Edmund, a Catholic school, which was predominantly Irish and Italian. I didn't sing the national anthem or say the Pledge of Allegiance because, according to my father, our country refused to recognize us as full citizens or even as human beings. When my father died, my family decided not to request a flag for his coffin. He'd served in a segregated Navy just after World War II and was honorably discharged, but he never spoke to me about his service. It appears to have been a very traumatic experience for him. My mother, ever the diplomat, instructed me to stand for both the anthem and the pledge, though I didn't have to sing the former or recite the latter. Just do like the little Jehovah's Witness boy does, she said. The Jehovah's Witness she referred to was one or one of 2 or 3 remaining white students in the entire school. At one point, I resumed reciting the Pledge of Allegiance because I like reciting things from memory, and I especially like the sound of that declarative ending with liberty and justice for all. The Star-Spangled Banner never held that kind of appeal for me, since it's so militaristic and bombastic. Even today, I stand for it, but I do not sing it. The Star-Spangled Banner is my least favorite of the patriotic American songs. Another, My Country 'Tis of Thee, has been forever ruined for me by my father's rewriting of the lyrics. My country 'tis of thee, land of no liberty. In contrast, I've grown to love Woody Guthrie's This Land Is Your Land because of its expansive, inclusive sense of the nation. However, America the Beautiful is the one that I find most appealing, perhaps because of Ray Charles's soulful rendering of it, or because it portrays the country's wondrous natural beauty. I especially came to appreciate the magnificent landscape after a cross-country drive when I was a young adult. It is the one thing I love about this land without ambivalence. During my brief time with my father, I learned of his disdain for what he saw as the country's hypocrisy. He taught me that the Vietnam War was a travesty and shared his belief that Black people shouldn't fight for the country, especially not against other people of color. And I can still recall reciting my opinions on the war to his buddies when I accompanied him to the barbershop. They showered me with praise. That little sister sure can rap, and they gave me a lot of quarters. From my current vantage point, I would describe my father as a Black nationalist. His nationalism was informed by his youth as a bebopper and his brief stint in the Nation of Islam. He loved Malcolm. He prided himself on actually having met with him during his frequent visits to Philadelphia. Nonetheless, Emerson Griffin possessed a deep admiration for the founding documents, and though critical, he held a kind of disdainful awe for U.S. military might. What I have learned of my father in the years following his death tells me that at some point he was a bit more hopeful about the country's possibility for racial reconciliation. When he was a student getting an associate's degree at Temple University, he was in the NAACP, so I assume he believed in the reformist nature of that organization. And my 3 earliest memories of my father are, 1, the sound of his melodic whistle as he turned the corner on his way home from work. 2, watching from our living room window as he built me a snowman. And 3, his returning home following a march he'd participated in. The latter memory stood out because it was one of the rare times I saw him in a suit, gray, and a tie, and because of a round yellow button he wore on his lapel, back to the wall. He had been protesting the racial exclusion of Girard College, a boarding school for fatherless boys founded by Stephen Girard, who was a 19th century banker and philanthropist. There are many things named for Girard in the city of my birth, including Girard Estates in South Philadelphia within walking distance from our row home. A small, exclusive enclave of well-kept homes, the Estates seem to have operated under a restrictive covenant. In my childhood, no Black people lived there. Upon his death, his will established a boarding school for poor, male, white orphans, which opened in 1848 in North Philadelphia. Girard College sat behind 10-foot walls in the midst of what became a Black working-class neighborhood in the mid-20th century. Although Raymond Pace Alexander, esteemed lawyer, activist, politician, and later judge, brought court cases to desegregate the school, he was unsuccessful. Under the leadership of the charismatic Cecil B. Moore, the Philadelphia branch of the NAACP launched a campaign of direct action protests against Girard College. Starting in May '65, protesters held daily marches and weekly rallies, and on August 3, 1965, Martin Luther King joined Moore to address the rally. I think this was the event my father attended. I cannot imagine him wearing a suit to any of the other marches. 5 years later, in 1968, the Supreme Court finally struck down the ban on Black students in a school here in Philadelphia. By word and example, my father taught me that protests and resistance were both personal and collective. We march, we stand up, or sit down for what we believe, and we read. He insisted that reading and study were central to our struggle as a people and to my overall development as a human being. And one morning, before I left for school, my father gave me 2 paperback books. On the title page of Black Struggle, A History of the Negro in America by Brian Folks, he wrote, "Jazzy, read this book. You may not understand it at first, but read it and understand. Daddy. Baby, read it until you understand. Ask your teacher if you don't. She will like you for it. If you just know this book, I will be happy. Daddy." The second one was a small paperback book with red, white, and blue cover and it was titled The Little Red, White, and Blue Book, Revolutionary Quotations by Great Americans. And he hadn't written notes on the title page there, he'd written them within and throughout. Start here, Jazz, there's lots of Frederick Douglass. My father died within months of me giving me these books, so they took on an even weightier connotation for me. They held a version of history that I did not learn in school. This was no Star-Spangled Banner history. The Little Red, White, and Blue book referred to this land is your land, more to a this land is your land perspective, and Black Struggle was closer to Gil Scott-Heron's Winter in America. You may remember the lyrics, "From the Indians who welcomed the Pilgrims, and to the buffalo who once ruled the plains like vultures circling beneath the dark clouds looking for the rain, looking for the rain. The Constitution, a noble piece of paper, would free society. It struggled, but then died in vain. And now democracy is ragtime on the corner hoping for some rain. And it looks like it's hoping for some rain. And now it's winter, winter in America. Yes, and all the healers have been killed or sent away. Ain't nobody fighting because nobody knows what to save. Save your soul, Lord knows, from winter in America." Those are Heron's lyrics. The books, though published just a brief time before Heron's music first appeared, are of a related era. Move on here. Frederick Douglass appears in both books. My father owned copies of the 1845 narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass and the 1855 My Bondage and My Freedom. He revered both Malcolm and Douglass as much for their autodidactism, which he shared, as for their eloquence and courage, to which he aspired. I now understand that the two of them, Frederick Douglass and Malcolm X, have very different conceptions of the nation that gave birth to them. For Douglass, the United States is a work in progress, capable of being perfected. For Malcolm, it was irredeemable. Perhaps my father started out like Douglass and ended up like Malcolm. Following this section, I talk about 2 of Douglass's speeches, the most famous being, with which most of us are familiar, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, and provide a kind of analysis of that speech and its belief. It turns on a belief in the Constitution, saying that the Constitution is a liberty document. And so that's the kind of, abolitionism that he kind of stakes a claim in. It's also a speech where he breaks with Garrison, who had been his mentor, right? So it's known for his break with Garrison. And so I do a reading of that speech and then conclude the Douglass section with a lesser-known speech by Douglass in 1859, just before John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. Douglass, it wasn't a speech, he published an editorial titled The Ballot and the Bullet. It strikes a blow against his former Garrisonian comrades who asserted that abolitionists should use only the, quote, sword of the spirit, foregoing both the voting booth and violence in their pursuit of slavery's abolition. In contrast, Douglass wrote, and I quote, "If speech alone could have abolished slavery, the work would have been done long ago. What we want is an anti-slavery government in harmony with our anti-slavery speech, one which will give effect to our words and translate them into acts. For this, the ballot is needed, and if this will not be heard and heeded, then the bullet. We've heard cant enough and are sick of it." So the ballot and the bullet is a Douglass editorial. Over a century later, at Cleveland, Ohio's Corey Methodist Church, on April 5th, 1964, 1 month after breaking with his own mentor, Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X delivered a speech that would become known as the ballot or the bullet. And so it's interesting that the less radical, racially radical Douglas says the ballot and the bullet. And Malcolm says the ballot or the bullet. So he gives a couple of versions of this speech, but I talk about the one that he gave in Cleveland. He makes no pretense of claiming the United States for Black Americans. For him, blacks are Africans, not Americans. In other versions of the speech, Malcolm uses America's national symbols as an opportunity to create some of his most effective wordplay. Famously, our forefathers weren't pilgrims. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. The rock landed on us. In opposition to Douglas, who insists that the Constitution is an anti-slavery document that does not endorse slavery, Malcolm tells his audience, "We were brought here against our will. We were not brought here to be made citizens. We were not brought here to enjoy the constitutional gifts that they speak so beautifully about today, because we weren't brought here to be made citizens. Today, now that we've become awakened to some degree and we begin to ask for those things which they say we are supposedly for all Americans, they look upon us with hostility and unfriendliness." So he's advocating the vote as part of his break with Elijah Muhammad. I follow this with a discussion of Barack Obama, both as a statesman and as, the first president of the United States, but also as an extraordinary writer in this tradition about which I write, and who is very self-consciously aware of himself as writing himself into that tradition as well. I don't imagine either Douglas, with his hope for in America having been constantly challenged, or Malcolm, who never acquired hope in the nation's possibilities, could have imagined the rise of a Barack Obama. For that matter, neither would my father have imagined the possibility of Barack Obama's political career. I know he would have been ambivalent about anyone who wanted to be president of the United States, though I expect he would have been as proud of Obama the candidate as my mother was, if less enamored. The foundations laid by Douglas and Malcolm, as well as Martin Luther King Jr., provided the ground from which Obama ascended. As a young man, he became more fully aware of the tradition represented by Douglas and Malcolm, and he engaged with their ideas and sought to shape his own identity and worldview. All three men were readers and thinkers, and each penned powerful and influential autobiographies, all true works of American literature. All three were great orators of great power, charisma, and dynamism. I go on to talk about both the autobiography, Dreams from My Father, as well as, and perhaps even more so, the famous race speech that Obama gives here in Philadelphia, where he chooses to break from his own mentor, Jeremiah Wright, and lay forth his vision. And this is, if you recall, he had been avoiding making any kind of public pronouncements about race, and yet he was pushed into having to do so. And so I talk at length about that speech in relation to the other two, the Malcolm as well as the Frederick Douglass. At the close of his speech, Obama implores us that we must believe that society can change, that we can work together to perfect the union and to build a future that is better for all of our children. Obama's race speech will go down in history as one of the most significant in our national history, and unlike the speeches of Douglas, it does not bear witness to whites about the suffering of Black people. Unlike the speeches of Malcolm, it is not addressed to Black people about the ways to organize and move forward in our struggle for freedom. It is addressed to the nation. It is more closely aligned with the James Baldwin of The Fire Next Time. However, unlike Baldwin, who assumed a relatively small group of conscious Blacks and whites would forge change against all odds, Obama insists that this is the work of the new America, of all of us, or at least the majority of us, or the majority necessary to assure his election and thus stake the future in the project he represents. As with the speech he delivered at the 2004 Democratic Convention, it proposes a beautiful vision of American possibility. It invokes the liberal philosopher Richard Rorty's reformist left, which Rorty described as, quote, all those Americans who between 1900 and 1964 struggled within the framework of constitutional democracy to protect the weak from the strong. Toward the end of Dreams of My Father, Obama writes, "We hold these truths to be self-evident. In these words, I hear the spirit of Douglass and Delaney, Jefferson and Lincoln, the struggles of Martin and Malcolm, and unheralded marchers. I hear all of these voices asking the very same questions that have come to shape my life. What is our community, and how might that community be reconciled with our freedom? How far do our obligations reach? How do we transform mere power into justice, mere sentiment into love?" These are the words, the questions that drove the young man who momentarily transformed us into a nation of believers, a nation that was willing to give hope a chance. It paints a vision of a nation we aspire to be. It raises the timeless questions, questions that ennoble us and lift us even in the asking of them. And yet, the reaction to this vision so angered and so frightened a swath of America, the backlash against it and Obama so harsh and swift that it stunned even those of us who never shared his optimism. Yet, we wanted to hold out. We did hold out hope that the change he described might one day be possible. Many of us understood the words of Toni Morrison, who in an interview with The Guardian recalled feeling, quote, truly American for the first time when she attended Obama's 2008 inauguration. She said, quote, "I felt very patriotic. I felt like a kid. The Marines and the flag, which I never look at, all of a sudden it looked nice, worthy. It only lasted a couple of hours. But I was amazed. That music that I really don't like, I mean, God Bless America is a dumb song. I mean, it's not beautiful. But I really felt that for that little moment." Black Americans' understanding of America is too realistic, too cautious, too conscious of the lessons of history to possess an unbridled patriotism. We know that at best our country is a work in progress and that the battle to perfect it is an uphill climb. Nowhere was this more evident than in the electorate's response to the 2 terms of an Obama presidency. The racial resentments of large numbers of voters had been simmering since his first presidential campaign, and one could witness elements of it in the crowds that flocked to see and hear Sarah Palin, the running mate of Republican nominee John McCain. The not-so-subtle anger and racism of many of her supporters stood in full sight with the emergence of the Tea Party, and this is the energy that helped to bring an explicit racist into the presidency in 2016. Significantly, also under Obama, the nation witnessed a number of high-profile vigilante murders of Black people, which gave birth to the Black Lives Matter movement. And I dare say that fear and anger over that movement and over the Obama administration's critical engagement with it also contributed to the political ascension of the authoritarian whose administration presented a challenge to the very notion of democracy. The struggle for Black freedom continues. The struggle over the ideal of America is ongoing as well. So that's a swift trip through that chapter. Time for questions? Yeah, so I'll stop and questions or comments or whatever conversation, whatever. Any thoughts? Mm-hmm. Nope. Yes.
Thank you so much, Farrah. Wonderful. This is just a question that's been on our minds here sort of as a starting point, since you talked so much about Philadelphia's and America's symbols and how we wrestle with them. What suggestions do you have to those who are starting to think about 2026?
In terms of 1776?
That's coming up, so this is much on the minds of lots of folks.
Yeah. I think, I hope that, I remember 1776 in Philadelphia. I think they moved the Liberty Bell. I don't know if anyone was here, but as a kid, I went down and watched as they were moving the Liberty Bell or something. They did something with the Liberty Bell. Oh, maybe they moved it over from Independence Mall over to the center where it is now. I would hope that it would be the opportunity for an honest discussion about, so much has happened since 1976, and so much that we've learned, and so much history that's been uncovered. And I think of someone like Erica Armstrong Dunbar's book on Ona Judd, you know, the woman who had been enslaved by George Washington. And so I don't mind honoring kind of the place that Philadelphia has held, but we've just done so much work to make that a much richer and deeper and more complex history that I think that 2026 will offer the opportunity to put that history on display and to show how our refusal to reckon with it has unfortunately led to so many of the problems that we confront. And I would hope that the city would be a leader in that regard. You know, it's the kind of leadership, the kind of civic leadership that is needed during a time when, you know, one response is to not teach history, to literally whitewash history. That it's for us to see this as an opportunity for trying to figure out how to get it right, how to do it right. And there's just so much brilliant work at our hands, now that had not been done in 1976. So reading groups and, discussion groups and offering communities to come in and help shape how they tell that story. And I mean, I just think it's a tremendous opportunity to do that. Yeah. And maybe they won't move the Liberty Bell again. I don't know. Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Layla. I'm a student at the law school.
Okay.
But I have a master's in studies and a master's in English.
Okay.
I was just drawn and intuitively a fit. So I was, I guess, I was wondering if, I have a long question.
Mm-hmm.
In this kind of time of like social media, where like where Michaela Cole, aptly put that visibility equates to success all the time. And thinking about, the state of polarization, depolarization, and the heightened position that puts not only polarization between the right and the left, but also on how to move forward in liberatory, with the liberatory agenda. So gaining literacy in some of these things, like the Constitution, going to law school or going, through an Africana studies program,
Right.
Being in an institution like that, insofar as it requires, buy-in, if not just to pay back loans and things like that. I'm interested in your thoughts about mechanisms for accountability, or just different ways that the individuals who are grappling with the pressure of the buy-in that it takes to get literacy. What do you think about that? And
Yeah.
what advice you give?
Wow, that's a big question, but I think that what I would start with is that it doesn't require the buy-in to get the literacy, right? So, and I'm not saying that the buy-in isn't required for many things, right? Like, and we could unpack the term buy-in. So certainly there's a certain amount of buy-in that would be required for a certain kind of success or whatever, right? But the literacy doesn't require the buy-in. And I think if there's one lesson of my book, that's the lesson, right? Is that I was taught by a working class Black man and his community of friends. My father was a welder at Sonship, and he was pretty much an autodidact, and it was the free library and bookstores. At that time, it was a bookstore that I loved as a little girl on 13th Street called Robbins Bookstore. But Philadelphia has a legacy of like dynamic independent bookstores, a House of Our Own bookstore, and now Uncle Bobby's and Harriet's. I mean, somebody could do a history on the independent bookstores, Black leftist bookstores. And so those were places where the literacy was acquired. I learned the Bill of Rights from my father. I learned the preamble to the Constitution from my father. I learned the Declaration of Independence from my father. You know, and what I would say is that there was a time when the American public education system offered that. I know that my parents weren't the only ones who got that education, and maybe, you know, it was called rote and it wasn't critical thinking. They had to memorize and they learned how to write cursive and they wrote it, but they knew it. You know, or part of what the Black Peanut, I remember Robin's bookstore where my father bought those little books. In addition to having those books on sale on the tables, they would have little books of the Constitution. It's the same Constitution that that gentleman at the Democratic National Convention, the Gold Star family father, took out of his pocket very proudly and said he would give it to the man whose name I don't mention in my book, that he would give it to him. That's available. And I think what might be missing, and maybe some of those of us who have benefited from the buy-in, is helping to organize ways that people have access to and can read that, because they don't necessarily get it in public school anymore. And I think that's one of the reasons why we end up where we are right now, right? The kind of defunding of public school education that used to be about creating, you know, it used to be that you needed an educated citizenry for democracy. That was our belief, right? That you needed an educated citizenry. They didn't have to buy in, right? That was a part of what you got for being a citizen. And now it seems it's just the opposite. We don't want an educated citizenry. Right? So I think that's where I would maybe just offer a different mode, that the literacy does not have to come with, you know, you don't have to go to Penn Law School to have access to the Constitution. You have to go to Penn Law School to get a certain kind of education about the Constitution and how to use it in the court of law. But even that, I mean, you think about all the jailhouse lawyers who probably know the Constitution as well as Obama does. So I hope that, if nothing else, that this book will remind people that there are literacies that are available to us even outside the walls of places like this. So I didn't answer your full question, but some of it, yeah. Guthrie. Guthrie, whose name I spelled wrong in his book when I signed it.
Professor Grimmett, thank you for this book. I think it's an instant classic. It, you know, as soon as it landed, I just really believe that people will be reading this book in Africana studies and Black studies of all kinds for many, many years. It's got that kind of weight. You and I have known each other a long time. And one thing about this book is that it clarifies to me some of the connections we have, South Philly and South Side of Chicago.
Right.
My father had a whistle.
Yes.
And we heard it and you're supposed to come.
Right, right, yeah.
He did not talk about his World War II service in the same way that my white friends' dads talk about their service.
Right.
It was never mentioned. Never talked about it. So I'm fascinated that you decided to include them. My first quick question is about the use of memoir in scholarly text. You are revealing a lot about, you know, Black life in America, which is sometimes treated as an abstract from professors and not as part of their own narrative. You know, I do that in my own writing too. And my first question is, can you talk about your decision to do that? What were the challenges?
Right.
The second question has to do with what you just read to us, which when I read that chapter, I was just simply amazed at how you could deal with the three thinkers, talk about their break with their mentors, talk about their speeches, talk about their autobiographies, and then give us an intertextual reading, which is really not just about reading. It's actually a moral ethic that you often don't read in scholarly texts.
Right.
Because you're trying to tell us something about the world in an almost prophetic or theological fashion. Can you talk about those two things,
Yeah.
please?
Well, thank you for reading so closely. You know, you've been one of my interlocutors for decades, for all the books, you know, so thank you. So I think my answer to both the memoir and to the kind of sort of ethical impulse of the book, they're the same, it's the same answer. So you're right, like as a scholar, both of those things are things that we avoid, you know, and in a different kind of book, I would avoid too. You know, in Who Set You Flowing, I mean, it's there because it's always there, but it's not explicitly there, right? But, you know, there's a kind of ethics that is suggested by my reading of migration narratives. And the very fact that I'm interested in migration narratives at all is because I'm a grandchild of migrants, and I was trying to figure out what was that, you know? So it's there. But in this book, I think I just made a decision that at this stage in my career, you know, and having done the refereed articles and written the book, and that I probably will go back and do more of that too, that's a genre of writing, and that I believe there is a place for it, but that's not what this book was. And what I wanted to say was, and this is again about the buy-in in a way, right? I wanted to say, I've been teaching this body of literature to undergraduates and graduate students for all these years, and I've been keeping up with all the ways, all the interventions, and how we talk about it, and because I want to be, you know, give the best to my students. But that's not how I came to this stuff, this literature. That's not what I was taught was important about it. And the things that were important about it, and not all of these books, because some of these books weren't published when I was a little girl, you know, but I was taught that there was something important that these writers were doing, and that that if I read, I would be a smarter person, I'd be a better person, and I would understand our predicament a little better. And I still thought that the literature had that value, right? And it might not be the value that I would point out in the classroom to my students, but a lot of people read Toni Morrison who are not sitting in our classrooms, you know, and are looking to that literature for something else that feeds them, right? And that gives some answers to some questions. And when Baldwin was writing those essays, he was, you know, he's trying to organize. I mean, he's trying to get people to move to action. And then when he's writing the novels, he's imagining, you know, a set of possibilities. And so I just wanted to return back to that, where it's okay to talk about the moral and ethical dimensions of a piece of writing. It's okay to do that. And also to give people a story and to tell the truth about why I'm compelled by these books. So I think that's what it was. I think I just thought, I knew that I was trying to write something very different from my ordinarily scholarly work. And in some ways to just come out, you know, to just like come out as a working class Black girl whose family struggled with poverty and addiction, but still were like deeply loving and really smart and read, you know, and talked about music in very insightful ways. So, yeah, and you know that because that's race music does that. You know that, right? Yeah. Okay. Other queries, questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Lauren from the PhD student at Edinburgh. And I guess I had a similar question, and I guess follow-up about using memoir as a scholar. I think about my own project and sort of the emotional labor involved and all the entanglements there and how you sort of think through those. And how you decide what to share and what not to share. And there are moments where, you know, maybe you find something surprising or you read something, maybe a note from your family and you decide, no, that's mine, maybe,
Right.
and that's not something I would include in the book. So I guess moments like that and sort of how you navigate it.
Yeah. So I think I've included memoir in some of my scholarship, but not like this. Like this is, you know, one of the three things this book is a memoir, right? And you know, I I don't know, did you see Imani Perry's article in the New York Times this weekend about Gail Jones's novel Palmares, right? So that is sort of memoir as the scholar seeking the writer, right? You know, and I found this in her archive, and it can be uncomfortable, but it's not revealing some truth about the scholar, right? It's basically bringing you along on the trip and the joy of discovery in the archive, right? So that's a first person, right? Memoir is a different beast. And I don't even know that, I mean, to me, it belonged here because my readings are part of my memoir. My reading is part of my autobiography, right? I can't give and they're books about books. Carla Holloway has a book called Bookmarks, where scholars write about reading, and that's where I saw this one. The difference between memoir and autobiography is, for me, is I have no, it's not like I'm trying to tell it all. Like an autobiography, a big autobiography, is sort of a promise to your reader that you're going to tell it all. A memoir is not, I'm not telling it all. So I'm telling you, the memoir parts of this book are primarily about the circumstances leading up to my father's death and the immediate aftermath that included reading, but also included a community and a family that took care of a widow and her daughter, right? So anything that didn't fit that didn't belong. And then there are other things that I just, chose that were there, and then I thought, you know what? It's not my story to tell. It might have happened to a girl in my neighborhood, and I have absorbed it as part of my story, but that's her story. It's not my story to tell. So it was left out. And then there are other things where I'm like, I need to change that person's name. So that's the kind of choices you make around memoir, because memoir is really about a specific thing or time or moment or place, and it helps you edit what goes in and what comes out. But I think that the scholarly eye is a little bit different. I hope that answers your question. Yeah. Okay. Is it? Okay, there's a hand here and then one back here. Yes.
That was so moving on so many different levels, thank you. And I was particularly struck when you were reading about and reading the Frederick Douglass speech, how present your father's note was in my mind, and the jazz, and the way you read his note, and how I don't know that I'm ever going to think of that speech again without that context, and how grateful I am for that. And I've been thinking with all of our questions about the ways in which knowledge is love and love is knowledge, and the ways in which what we believe it emotionally, not because it's based on fact, which is part of why we're in some trouble. I think my question is only wanting to hear more about. I mean, I've heard about you as a mentor and professor, so I kind of already know that you teach with love, and that you do translate knowledge into love as a kind of essential form of knowledge. It's not so much a question as just wanting to hear more about that.
Yeah. So, I said I was on a conversation last night with my friend and former colleague Robin Kelly, and one of the things I said is that because of the way my first teacher, that I equate teaching with love. I equate teaching as an act of love, and I create and not in a sappy way, in a difficult way, and I love literature. I love analysis. I love and the classroom as a space, at least a space of respect and care, is very important. But always a fact, and always, and one of the reasons why it needs to be a space of care is because it's also a space of discomfort, and coming up against things that are very uncomfortable, and that's partly what we do together. We work through it together, and and not always, and sometimes saying, okay, put your feelings aside, right? We all have feelings. These are my feelings, right? But you have to put your feelings aside and let's just look at what this text is saying. What is it telling? And I know it feels like Toni Morrison knew your grandmama, but she didn't, So we have to make that kind of separation. But I think that's always, for me, done in a space where you won't get attacked, you won't get assaulted, you won't be made to feel stupid. We all feel like we come up against how much we don't know. And that, to me, I used to be so afraid of that moment, right? But now that's such a great moment when you come up, because then you're open, you can learn, right? So you can feel stupid in that way, but not because somebody is nasty and mean and tells you what you think is stupid, right? So, I think it's a balancing act between that kind of bringing one's full self, but also being able to be uncomfortable or being able to separate what you feel from what you think, even though one informs the other. So, and there was a question back here.
Hi, I'm Ashley Cartwright. I'm the PhD student here. And Ashley is African American literature here at Columbia. I was interested in how you came to the different chapters.
Yeah.
And also the role of Christianity in theology.
Yep.
In the book. I was thinking about it in the mercy chapter.
Yeah.
How that chapter matters.
That's a great question. So the irony is, I didn't grow up in the church. My father was an agnostic. I said, like one night last week, I was saying that one of the first songs I remember him teaching me was Gershwin's "It Ain't Necessarily So." I don't know if you know the lyrics that, like, now what you're liable to read in the Bible, it ain't necessarily so. I'm like 4 years old, I knew that song. So, but I grew up in South Philly in a black neighborhood, and the church was all around me. It was everywhere. And even as I was defining myself over and against it, it was defined, that's what the standard was. It was everywhere. So the book, the terms came to me. Initially, I thought that I was going to be writing about democracy. That's what I thought. And I thought I was going to have these democratic principles, and I was going to show the way Black writers wrote about those principles. And I was going to show the way Ann Petrie writing about Ludi Johnson in Harlem in 1940s and showing how naive and crazy Ludi is for thinking that she can be like Benjamin Franklin, and that one of the texts that book is in conversation with is the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. That's what I thought I was going to do. I thought a lot of things I was going to do with this book that didn't happen. But then as I began reading more and more and also thinking about the context in which I was writing, I thought, it's not that that's not in the books, but the way these books are speaking to me right now are about these broader issues and ideals and values that transcend nation, and transcend and are raced in some ways, but also are not about race, and that some of them we mostly associate with Christianity, but you can find elements in them in other spiritual traditions as well. So that's how they came, and mercy came first, because I kept thinking about Toni Morrison's novel, A Mercy, and Phyllis Wheatley. And, Florence, if you've read that novel, just like Wheatley, Florence, they figure out how old Florence is when she gets to New England because of the condition of her teeth, which is what they did with Phyllis Wheatley. And Phyllis Wheatley, as a little girl, used to write on the walls. She was obsessed with writing. She used to write on the walls. And Florence, the novel closes with Florence writing on the walls. So I was like, okay, I got to bring these two. I got to bring Florence and Wheatley together, and mercy is the way I'm going to do it. Right. So that's how that happens. I knew the book was going to end on grace. I knew it was going to end on grace. I didn't know what was going to come in between, but I knew that it was going to start with mercy and end with grace. And the irony about grace, and this will close to go back to your question about Christianity. So I didn't grow up in the church. I had a lot of friends who did, and some of them were more fundamentalist than others. And the more fundamentalist ones were the ones who talked to me about burning in hell. Like, if you don't get saved, you're going to burn in hell. But I had other friends who actually, one in particular, who taught me about the concept of grace. I just liked the word. I thought, if I have a daughter, I'm going to name her Grace. And we had this theological conversation as girls about what grace meant. And I thought, oh, I love that. That's the most amazing concept ever. And so I knew that I wanted the book eventually to end on grace, because I felt like, grace is unmerited reward. You can't do anything to earn it. And I thought, okay, well, if we're going to be saved, saved not in the Christian way, but like as human beings on this planet that we've destroyed, it's going to be grace. It's going to be our own work and effort, but we certainly don't deserve it given what we've done. So that's how, so even the theological, I love reading theology, but the theological stuff also came from the ground up as well. Yeah. Because Black saved girls can talk some theology now. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sarah Jasmine Griffin. That was a master class, right? Everything, that was a master class. The book is tremendous. It is simply majestic. And now, if you do not have a copy, you may buy one, and Farrah Jasmine Griffin will sign it. Thank you, Farrah Jasmine Griffin.